Do you ever spot tacky, outdated items at the thrift store and wonder what you could possibly do with them? Well, the thrift store finds in today's video all started out as cheap, mass produced decor from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But with a little creativity, we can transform them into pieces that look like timeless antiques. I can't wait to show you how you can turn your modern thrift store finds into decor that looks 100 years old.
This gilded book looks like somebody's DIY project, but it was actually a mass produced item in the 1960s. Although I love the 23rd Psalm, I'm going to decoupage over the Bible pages with botanical prints. I printed out the images large enough to fully cover each page, which would conceal the damaged areas. Due to the uneven surface, I was afraid if I used Mod Podge, it would cause the paper to bubble. So instead, I adhered the prints using glue stick. Just be sure to use a good quality glue stick like Elmer's Craft Bond. To give the paper edges a naturally aged appearance, I used a sanding block along all of the edges. Again, I chose not to seal the paper with Mod Podge because I was concerned about bubbling. To turn the book into wall decor, I found a frame in my stash that was slightly larger than the book. I threw away the glass and removed the heavy cardboard backing. I wanted to cover the cardboard with fabric and chose a piece of green velvet cut from a thrift store pillow sham. Just fold the edges to the back and hot glue them in place. Next, I hot glued the book to the center of the velvet covered cardboard. But because the book is somewhat heavy, I didn't want to rely on glue alone. I flipped the cardboard over and stapled through the board into the book, along the spine and along the book edges. I placed the board back in the frame and secured it in place. For resale, I like to clean up the back of pictures with brown craft paper. I just use glue stick or spray adhesive to adhere it to the frame. This frame didn't have any hanging hardware, so I attached a sawtooth hanger. I use so many of these that I buy them in bulk from Amazon. In the 1800s, books were expensive and displayed with pride. However, only individual pages were framed. So, this is not a historically accurate DIY, but it is definitely Victorian inspired. We've all seen these metal bird cages. I think this one's cute, but with a few small changes, we can make it look like an antique cloche rather than a bird cage. In the 19th century, wire cloches were used in gardens to protect precious plants. I easily hammered out the metal floor. Then I removed the other elements that seemed too modern, the latch and the metal bird on the top. That's right, I actually removed a bird. I removed this one using my angle grinder. To make it look like one piece, I reattached the lid to the cage using silver florist wire in several spots. Then I dabbed some rust-colored acrylic paint on the silver spots where the bird and the latch had been to blend it in with the other rusted areas on the cage. I think these small changes made a generic birdcage look like a unique vintage or antique find. And as a bonus, it has successfully kept my cat from chewing on these flowers. I found a listing for this corner cabinet on eBay, and the description said mahogany display cabinet. But I can assure you, this is not mahogany wood. It's something much cheaper. And the shelves are so small, they can't hold much. So I decided to remove them. I loosened the screws holding the back brace, and then I slid out the shelves. I decided I wanted to remove the two back panels too. So I removed the screws holding the wood base in place and slid them out. And since I was going to paint the cabinet, I went ahead and removed the door too. I like quality stained wood, but that's not what I have here. So I'm going to give it 2 coats of black chalk paint. When the paint was dry, I wanted to give it an aged appearance, so I lightly distressed the edges with a sanding block. Then I sealed the paint with antiquing wax, brushing it on and wiping off the excess. I prefer using antiquing wax over clear wax on black paint because I think it gives the black more dimension. Before replacing the back panels, I covered them with scraps of a William Morris peel and stick wallpaper. I cut the wallpaper to size and then I adhered it to the back of each panel rather than going over the velvet. Then, when I slid them back into the cabinet, I flipped them so that the velvet was on the outside. Once the cabinet was fully reassembled, I painted the wood seams around the velvet squares with black chalk paint to make them blend in with the velvet. Victorians loved display cabinets to showcase figurines, natural curiosities, and single floral arrangements. To create a base for a few faux flowers, I hot glued moss to a rounded piece of styrofoam and then hot glued the styrofoam to the floor of the cabinet. I added 3 poppies, cutting their stems to varying heights for visual variety. Victorians gave various flowers emotional symbolism. White poppies were associated with peace and consolation. This plastic framed print was a popular home interiors item in the mid 1980s. I love a small round or oval frame, but I don't like that this one is so obviously plastic. However, a few coats of chalk paint will take care of that. Black and ebony finishes were trendy during the late 1800s and were often paired with gilding and brass hardware. So when the chalk paint was dry, I used my finger to apply some gold leaf rub and buff to highlight the frame's edges. Then I applied a coat of clear wax. This accomplished 2 things. It sealed the chalk paint and it softened the gold wax, which allowed me to wipe some of the excess off where I had applied too much. To create artwork for the frame, I used a floral IOD rub-on transfer, applying it directly to the glass for a layered effect. You could hot glue the glass into the frame if you want that see-through look, but for a more vintage appearance, I cut out a piece of black poster board to cover the cardboard backing and glued it directly over the dated 1980s picture. Then I punched out the screw holes and put everything back in place. There was only a hole in the cardboard to use for hanging, so I hot glued a loop of ribbon to the back. Victorians often used decorative cords or ribbon to suspend artwork from picture rails to avoid putting holes in plaster walls. I think what was once a cheap-looking plastic frame now looks like artwork you might find in a Victorian parlor. The cherry finish on this mantel clock dated to the late 1980s or early 1990s, and that red finish is what I like least about it. So I'm going to paint it. To expose the clock face, I first needed to unscrew 4 small nuts on the inside of the clock. Then I was able to remove the framed glass. As is the case with most modern clocks, the clock face is just an image printed on a piece of paper. So I measured and printed out an image of an antique clock face to use instead. I removed the clock hands and the existing face, but before attaching the new face, I gave the clock 2 coats of moss green chalk paint. Green was one of the most popular paint colors in the late 1800s, a reflection of the Victorians' love of nature. Once the paint was dry, I cut out my new clock face and cut a small hole in the center for the clock hands to attach to the spindle. The wood was still sticky from the original adhesive, so I just pressed the paper into place and reattached the clock hands. I used a utility blade to scrape off any paint that had gotten on the glass, and then I reattached the watch glass, which required tightening those tiny nuts on the inside. Floral motifs were extremely popular in Victorian decor and were often painted or stenciled onto the glass or wood of a clock case. I didn't have much space, but I managed to apply 2 small rose rub-on transfers below the clock face. The clock still looked too modern, so I used a sanding block to distress the green paint, and I even lightly sanded over the floral transfers. To seal the paint, I applied some very watered-down antiquing wax. I brushed over the entire clock before I started wiping off any of the excess. This resulted in an unexpected effect. The water softened the paint, so when I dabbed it away, I removed even more paint, giving it an even more authentically aged appearance. This little wicker basket was likely made in Shanghai in the 1970s, a time when Americans were in love with Chinese imports. 100 years ago, people often added fabric linings or covers to baskets to create closed storage. To replicate this idea, I'm cutting a piece of fabric from a thrift store pillow sham. I cut the fabric just slightly larger than the diameter of the basket. Then I sewed the 2 ends of fabric together to create a tube. I folded and ironed the top and bottom edges of the tube to the inside. Then I folded and ironed the top edge over a second time, creating a hem about an inch in width. Then I stitched a seam along the top and bottom folded edges. I used hot glue to attach the bottom hem to the inside rim of the basket. If you use a good quality glue stick, this bond will be incredibly strong. For the top larger hem, I used a seam ripper to cut a slit in the fabric next to a seam. To run a strand of jute rope through the hem, I attached a safety pin to the end of the rope. This makes it much easier to push the rope all the way around the tube and back out the original hole. To keep the ends of the rope from unraveling, I slid on a bead and tied the rope into a knot. Then I frayed the ends to create a small tassel. Victorians would likely have used a basket like this for sewing supplies or possibly bread, but I think it's perfect for storing onions in my pantry. This Hollywood Regency dressing table mirror was popular during the 1960s, but antique mirrors were usually framed in wood. However, small decorative mirrors were occasionally made of brass or bronze. So to make this mirror look antique, we just need to hang it on the wall. And the easiest way to do that is by running a loop of wire through the holes in the design. The wire can easily be removed to change it back into a tray. This Walmart trash can is 10 or 15 years old. Although it's still in great condition, it's certainly nothing special. Victorians used small decorative trash receptacles that match their decor. So I'm going to cover this plastic can with fabric cut from a thrift store Toile pattern curtain. Once I cut the piece of fabric to fit, I realized I could see the geometric design through the fabric. So I took the can outside and gave it 2 coats of Zinsser spray primer. Once the primer was dry, I sprayed the back of my fabric with Elmer's Craft Bond spray adhesive. Then I rolled the trash can over the fabric, pulling it taut. I trimmed off the extra fabric along the top and bottom edges of the can. Since the trash can is slightly angled, the fabric that overlapped on the side was also angled. So I cut off the extra fabric to create a straight edge, and then I folded under that cut edge. To make sure it stayed put, I hot glued the folded edge down. Then I hot glued some braided trim along the bottom and top edges of the can to conceal the cut edges of fabric. I used green trim because I had a bunch on hand, but I also think it's a nice contrast to the black and white fabric. Toile fabric originated in France in the 1700s and was wildly popular throughout Europe. And today it's considered a timeless design. If you saw last week's video, you know that I'm using this glass beverage dispenser to display my vintage doily collection. Now I want to repurpose the metal stand that came with it. To cut a piece of plywood to fit inside the stand, I created a pattern using 2 pieces of cardstock taped together. Once I slid the paper into place, I just traced and cut out the octagon shape. To gild the black metal base, I brushed on gold leaf rub and buff wax. Apply it sparingly to get a bronze effect, or apply it fully to get a brass effect. I used my paper pattern to cut out a piece of plywood to create a base so that I could use it as a plant stand. But I changed my mind and I trimmed the plywood to make it slightly smaller. Then I used the plywood to cut out 2 pieces of foam. I covered the top and sides of the foam with some polyester batting, and then I covered everything with the remaining piece of toile curtain fabric. To create the upholstery, I pulled the fabric taut to the underside of the plywood and stapled it in place. First, add 1 staple on each of the 4 sides and flip it over and check that it looks good on the top side. Add a few more staples to the sides and save the corners for last. Cut away any excess batting and fabric in the corners, then pull and gather the fabric. Make sure that the gathers are on the underside and that the top and side fabric looks smooth. Then staple the gathers in place. For an extra touch, I hot glued more of that green braiding along the bottom edge. Then I placed the cushion in the metal stand to create a very fancy vintage style footstool. I frequently find old hurricane lamps at the thrift store that are missing their glass chimneys, but I think the glass fonts or bases are lovely on their own. To use them as a vase, you could completely remove the brass burner, but I prefer to leave it and just remove the wick. This still allows a little space to add flowers with small stems. For a vintage touch, I tied on a bow using a piece of old lace hem tape. This lamp was only $2.49. You're not going to find a prettier vase for that price, even at Walmart. As I mentioned earlier, painting cheap plastic frames can totally change their appearance, and the same is true with inexpensive resin frames. I gave this one 2 coats of black chalk paint and then used gold leaf rub and buff to highlight the design. To seal it, this time I used antiquing wax rather than clear wax to tone down the gold and give it a bronze effect. You may not be able to see the subtle difference on camera, but the frame looks much more like painted wood now. For the artwork, I thrifted this book of watercolor paintings and cut out a picture that was a good size for the frame. I love projects like this. So simple, yet so satisfying. And framed art like this always sold really well for me in my resale booth. I hope today's video gave you lots of inspiration for your own thrift flips. And if you want even more ideas like these, here's another video I think you'll like. Thank you so much for watching today. Hope to see you next week.